Allow me to introduce you to Terra Smaraga. Okay, I'm sure you get the main gimmick of this gimmick build by now. It's just combining one of the most damaging spells in the game with one of the best buffs in the game and reaching numbers that are utterly absurd. I'm gonna break down how to make this build and what sort of weapons you might want to choose for it in a moment, but first I just want to get one thing clear. This build sucks. That's it. There's a central problem with the gimmick of the build, and basically you don't need Terra Magica, it's completely redundant. You're going to be killing people in much the same situations as you would if you'd used a regular Smarag. I'm sure you've seen the damage that the spell reaches. That's been featured by a couple of other YouTubers by now. It's absolutely insane. Terra Magica is completely overkill. It's honestly not as overwhelming as the footage makes it look. When I was using Terra Magica, I was kinda hitting up in the range of 800-900 damage per tick of the breath. Without Terra Magica, it was down at around 600-700 damage per tick of the breath, which on paper sounds pretty good. You're gonna go from like killing people with 3 or 4 ticks of breath to killing people with 2, but in practice, you very rarely only hit 2 ticks. Normally, once you've caught someone in the breath with a couple of ticks, they're going to get staggered, and then after that, they're going to get roll caught, and it's just going to be a whole cavalcade of ticks coming after them. I mean, like, separate bits of damage, not fucking smaller than 6. I'm getting off topic, moving on. You do occasionally hit 1 tick if someone runs up and trades with you, but the Terra Magica isn't giving you enough damage to just kill them outright in that case, so it's not worth mentioning. In the case of people using the Spellproof Liver, using Magic Fortification, those minor defensive buffs, you are going to be able to push through that regardless of if you have Terra Magica. Terra Magica is just going to make it easier, so I can't give that a point to Terra Magica either. In the case of exceptionally tanky targets, people with fingerprint shields, people who have applied Barrier of Gold and are now just getting tickled by magic, you aren't going to be making enough damage. Fingerprint shield, laughable, you're never getting through that. Barrier of Gold, you're getting maybe 200-300 damage per tick with Terra Magica, so it's okay, but it's not enough to stop them from just running at you and killing you, which was my experience when people used Barrier of Gold. So yeah, I just want to get that off and on the table. This isn't the miracle setup that's going to instantly obliterate everyone. Smarag is already that setup on its own. Terra Magica is just giving us overkill. I'm letting you know ahead of time, but now, let's just go into the weapons. We have 2 requirements for this build laid out already. We're using Terra Magica, so we know that ideally we want magic damage, and we're using Smarag with the Communion Seal, so we know that ideally we want arcane scaling. And there are 4 weapons in the game that can deal magic damage and have arcane scaling, excluding the ripple weapons with a magic grease on them, because they're pretty unremarkable and that's not what you want to use ripple weapons for. I'm getting off track. The clinging bone is probably the worst choice. It has respectable dex scaling, but the damage is still low. The arcane scaling that we actually want is trapped at a C, and the weapon art is locked to Lifesteal Fist, which is pretty bad. It's not going to do a lot. I wouldn't recommend bringing this one, but it's an option. Regalia of Yokade, the straight sword, is actually a pretty decent choice. C in Dex, C in Arcane, which, it's alright as far as scaling goes, but this one has a higher base magic damage, and you have to remember that Arcane scaling is going into both the magic and the physical damage on most of these weapons. Dancing Blade of Yokade is a really good weapon art. It just fucking one-shots people. It's great. Synergizes very well with holding the point where your Terra Magica is. You can run into it and get that buff and then use the weapon art and just fucking let rip. Marius Executioner Sword is very similar to the Regalia with the weapon art. It's in fact the exact same weapon art. The scaling is a little against our favor though. It drops down to a D in Arcane and a B in Strength. This is really more of a hybrid weapon, maybe a Strength build with a tiny bit of Arcane investment. It's not going to be good for someone who's trying to pump their Arcane as high as possible, as we're doing in this build. Clayman Harpoon is kind of the odd one out. Firstly, I have the stats listed here for an Occult Infusion. You can put it on Poison or, God forbid, a Bleed if you wanted. It would kind of be worth scaling, but you have the option. Note that arcane scaling is only applying to the physical portion of the weapon. I was very disappointed to find out that giving arcane scaling to the Clayman Harpoon doesn't allow the magic damage to scale off arcane. It was still scaling off of int as far as I could tell, because I was only getting like 70 extra magic damage, which was dumb. FromSoft, I would ask that you please change that, because that's how arcane scaling works on these other weapons. I don't understand, but really the standout, I'm going to talk over myself, but the standout feature of the Clayman Harpoon is, of course, you can give it any Asher War you want. That's what drew me to it, plus the fact that it's an excellent chase down weapon. You want the ability to chase people in case they somehow survive a Smarag, which happens every now and then. You know, like I said, Barrier of Gold. There are ways to survive it out there. You want something that can chase them down, this is it. Also, most of the damage is physical, which means you will still be able to function when someone has Barrier of Gold up. Barrier of Gold is really just anathema to this build, because it shuts down the gimmick that you have entirely relied upon. So watch the hell out for that, okay? Moving on to talk about the spell selection, there are a couple of interesting choices that open up for us because of our really weird spread. Firstly, it's worth mentioning that 20 int is the absolute bare minimum you're going to need. That's how much you need to unlock Terra Magica, and that's kind of how the whole build works. You know, that's 1/2 of Terra Smaraga. You need it. You also need 20 free faith for Smarag's Glintstone Breath, but you'll probably want to bring it up to 28 so you have access to Grail's Roar as well, because, you know, it's open to you, it's an excellent spell, why not use it? 20 int is enough to unlock all of the basic staple sorceries like Carrion Slicer, Swift Glintstone Shard, the Great Glintstone Shard, which is kind of like a downgrade to Comet, but it's about the best that we can get, etc, etc. Now let's talk about the interesting ones. Firstly, Rancor Call. This is one that you can slot in very easily, and it's just a very good spell, especially for the playstyle you want to go for, where you're holding the Terra Magica until you can get your shot, and potentially moving it around a couple of times to line it up. This forces your opponent to go on the defensive for a bit, and opens up an opportunity for you to blast them with Smarag, or chase them with your weapon. Your choice. I would 100% recommend bringing this, because it's really good. Ancient Death Rancor is a little too stat heavy to bring along. You could maybe work it in, but I don't think that's going to happen with any real arcane investment. Speaking of arcane investment, the Briar spells. Briars of Sin, the melee ranged one, and Briars of Punishment, the ranged one. They're both pretty shit. They're really stylish, but they're really, really bad, like bottom tier spells. This is theoretically the optimal setup for it too, because we're using the Albinuric staff with arcane scaling to do our casting. So we have arcane scaling on spells that are dealing bleed, so we're getting our bleed and our damage scaled up by arcane, but it's still just not performing. I took these off almost immediately once I realized how bad they are, but they are an option that's available to you if you want it. Magma spells, a little too heavy on the int. Gelmir's Fury is off limits, but you could get Roiling Magma and make use of that. That would help again with your area control, and it would also help you with getting access to fire damage instead of being entirely reliant on magic. But that's really up to you if you want to slot that in there. The spells that I ran were literally just Slicer, Swift Shard, Rancor Call, Great Shard, and Terra Magica, and then a couple of incantations. You don't really get too many slots to play around with, because you've got two that are being taken up by Terra Magica and Smarag. Duh, Terra Smaraga. You've got another couple of slots that are being taken up by Slicer and Swift Pebble because they're mandatory picks for any sorcerer because they're just so fucking good. And after that you've got, what is it, it's like 7 slots left to play around with, and you probably want to divide them up between Grail's Roar and then a handful of others. Grail's Roar takes up another 2, so you end up getting 5 slots, which isn't too much. Another one will probably go to a buff like Bestial Vitality, so you get 4 slots to play around with for damage dealing spells. At least on the setup that I was using. You can choose to do it differently. I think those 7 reserved slots are pretty much optimal, but that's a meaningless buzzword coming from a nobody YouTuber, so just do what you want, dude. But anyway, that is about all I have to tell you about this build. It is relatively easy to make. It's essentially just a meta sorcerer that is using arcane with the Albinuric staff instead of going full int, and in return gaining access to Smarag, gaining access to some incantations. I didn't end up using the incantations too much, so I literally was just basically a regular ass sorcerer that could turn around and pull out a thermonuclear weapon. Important to note, Terra Magica is a sphere, so if you jump cast over it, make sure you are jump casting over the center, otherwise your feet will be hanging above the area with the buff and you won't be getting it at all. I've had so many times where I've jumped over to my Terra Magica and gotten absolutely no fucking buff because I didn't actually hang my feet into that sphere. The other upside is you can cast the sphere while you're standing on the edge of a ledge, and that sphere will hang over, so you can actually jump cast underneath the point that you were standing if you're precise enough. I didn't end up using this too often, but it was a really cool trick. So there you go. Now you know it. But yeah, I don't have much more to say about the building of this build. I used veteran armor because I'm a fucking sweaty nerd apparently, and I just wanted to optimize my poise without thinking. You can do light roll, but you don't have a lot of points to invest into endurance, so you know, may as well take the best that you can get. This was all at level 125. You could obviously go higher, but you know, I'm not getting into that. This is all the information you need to know the basics. Expect to see maybe a couple of highlight videos with this build in the future, but for now, that's all I have for you. I really just wanted to get this out here, because Smarag was recently covered by another YouTuber. I think it was... who was it? I think it was G9? Did a couple of videos on how fucking brain dead Smarag is recently, and I wanted to capitalize on that before I get called a copycat. I have had this build on the back burner ever since the previous one, where it was Soul level 60. I believe I made an offhand comment about using all 3 stats. This is that build. I will put my spread on screen now for you to look at if you want. It's really not that remarkable, pretty much everything is going into Arcane. I could have invested more into strength and dex in order to play around the Regalia, but I didn't. If you are planning to use the Regalia, I recommend you bring Millicent's Prosthesis to cover up most of the dex cost and give you that buff to the weapon art. It's a really good 2-for-1 deal. Anyway, I'm gonna shut up now and I'll see you later. I'm out. And Terra Smaraga out. This is a fucking shit outro. Holy shit, where is the stop button?